It was early December 1940. As snow blanketed Europe and Britain stood firm across the Channel, Adolf Hitler made the most dangerous decision of his life. He would turn east. The Nazi war machine, still undefeated in Europe, now faced its greatest gamble, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It wasn't just another battle. It was a war against an entire ideology, against Bolshevism, against Stalin, against the East itself. In Hitler-twisted vision, this was more than conquest. It was a crusade. He spoke of Lebensraum, living space, that Germany deserved. And in his eyes, the vast lands of Ukraine and Russia were ripe for German colonization. But beneath the ideology lay another motive: fear. Hitler believed Stalin was arming faster than he admitted. He was convinced the Soviet Union would strike first, and that Germany had a narrow window to crush it. So on December 18, 1940, without consulting most of his generals, Hitler signed Directive 21, the order for Operation Barbarossa. It was bold. It was brutal. It was insane, because now Hitler was preparing to invade a nation that spanned 11 time zones. In the deadliest warfront the world had ever known, Germany had already conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. It had bombed Britain and shattered Yugoslavia. But this was different. The Soviet Union was a colossus, vast, unpredictable, and led by a man just as ruthless as Hitler himself, Joseph Stalin. Stalin had built his Red Army with paranoia. He had purged his own officers, executed thousands of commanders, and ruled by fear. His army was massive, but shaky, loyal, but disorganized, saw weakness. But what he didn't see was resilience. Still, the plan moved forward. By spring 1941, nearly 3 million German soldiers, the largest invasion force in history, began moving eastward. They weren't alone. Italy, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Finland, all joined Hitler's campaign. They believed the Soviet Union would collapse in weeks. Kick in the door, Hitler told his generals, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. And to some, it seemed possible. After all, Stalin's alliance with Germany had been uneasy at best. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in 1939, had divided Eastern Europe between the two powers. But it was a deal made with clenched jaws. Neither side trusted the other. Soviet intelligence had warned Stalin about Hitler's movements, again and again. Even Churchill had sent urgent messages, but Stalin refused to believe it. He was convinced Hitler wouldn't open a second front while Britain still stood. So when German trains began unloading tanks and troops near the border, Stalin ordered his army not to provoke them. He thought it was posturing, not preparation. But in Berlin, everything was being finalized. Operation Barbarossa was divided into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North, led by Field Marshal von Lieb, would drive through the Baltic states to seize Leningrad. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal von Bock, would smash through Belarus toward Moscow. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal von Rund, would storm into Ukraine and capture Kyiv. The goal: destroy the Soviet Union in a matter of months. German commanders were told the campaign would last no more than 10 weeks. They were even warned to carry summer uniforms only, because winter gear wouldn't be needed. The hubris was blinding. And then the countdown began. Across hundreds of miles of front, panzer divisions, artillery units, and Luftwaffe squadrons sat ready. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m., the quiet of dawn was shattered. Over 3,000 tanks roared into Soviet soil. Thousands of aircraft bombarded Red Army airfields. Artillery fire lit the horizon. Germany had launched the greatest land invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and Europe would. As the sun rose on June 22, 1941, the earth shook beneath the boots of 3 million German soldiers. The largest invasion in human history was underway. From the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, the Axis powers stormed across an 1,800-mile front. It was a lightning war, a blitzkrieg, supercharged by Nazi confidence and speed. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, many still sitting on the ground. Air superiority wasn't just achieved, it was stolen in the blink of an eye. German panzers surged forward with terrifying speed. Infantry units raced behind, mowing through dazed Red Army troops. Villages were overrun in minutes. Entire divisions collapsed before they could organize a defense. The Red Army, outgunned, poorly trained, and still reeling from Stalin's purges, wasn't ready. Commanders hesitated, orders were delayed, radios failed, and the Germans capitalized on every weakness. In the North, Army Group North thundered through the Baltic states. By July, they were approaching Leningrad. In the center, Army Group Center encircled and annihilated vast Soviet forces in Minsk and entire Soviet armies. Hundreds of thousands of men were trapped, surrounded, and forced to surrender. It was brutal, efficient, mechanical. And in the south, Army Group South launched a devastating strike into Ukraine. Kyiv, the capital of Soviet Ukraine, would soon become one of the most lethal battlegrounds of the war. By the end of July, the numbers were staggering. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops captured or killed, thousands of tanks and guns destroyed, entire cities lost without a fight. From Berlin, the news looked glorious. Hitler was doomed. In his eyes, the Red Army was finished. Stalin was humiliated. Moscow would fall within weeks. But deep in the heart of the Soviet Union, something darker was stirring. This wasn't France. This wasn't Belgium. This was Russia. And Russia had a history of absorbing pain and fighting back. But in the summer of 1941, even the Soviet people were in shock. They had trusted the pact with Germany. They had believed Stalin's silence meant strength. But now their world was in flames. Soviet propaganda barely kept up. State-run radios announced strategic withdrawals as cities fell. Posters called for total resistance, while tanks thundered past farmhouses. And still, the Red Army gave ground. The brutality of the German advance was unmatched. SS units and Einsatzgruppen, their orders: eliminate Jews, communists, partisans, and undesirable elements. Entire Jewish communities were executed in forests and ravines. Villages were burned, civilians slaughtered. It was not just war, it was genocide, hand in hand with conquest. And yet, in the chaos, the seeds of Soviet resistance were already taking root. In factories deep in the east, entire industries were evacuated by rail. Trains carried lathes, machines, engineers, anything that could be used to rebuild the war effort away from the front. Women took up rifles. Students became old men guarded bridges with Molotov cocktails. And above it all, Stalin, once paralyzed, he gave his first wartime radio speech on July 3rd. His voice, cold, deliberate, called for a great patriotic war. It was the beginning of a transformation. The man who had silenced his own people now begged them to fight for him. And somehow, they answered. But make no mistake, in the summer of 1941, Germany was still winning, and winning big. By August, German troops had advanced over 500 miles into Soviet territory. It was a victory on paper. In speed, in terrain, in prisoners, but cracks were forming in the steel. The Wehrmacht was advancing too fast. Supply lines were stretched. Fuel was running low. Spare parts were scarce, and Soviet resistance, though scattered, was growing fiercer by the day. Railroads were sabotaged, bridges blown, villagers poisoned wells and fed false information to advancing German troops. The myth of a quick victory was beginning to erode. And then came the first major delay. As Army Group Center prepared to push toward Moscow, Hitler issued a controversial order: halt the advance. Instead, he redirected forces south. His obsession with Ukraine's resources overrode military logic. Many generals, including Heinz Guderian, protested. They believed Moscow should be taken before winter. But Hitler was unmoved. The delay would prove costly. Still, The battle for Kiju became one of the largest encirclements in history. Nearly 600,000 Soviet troops were trapped and either killed or captured. Kiju fell. Germany cheered. But while Hitler celebrated, the calendar kept ticking. September was ending, and winter was coming. The Blitzkrieg had burned fast, but it had not burned out the Soviet Union. And now, the war was about to enter territory no general could conquer. Russian snow. October 1941. Leaves had turned blood red in the forests of the Soviet Union. Frost whispered across the fields. The German army, unstoppable for months, was now running out of time. The gates of Moscow were within reach. And yet, the war had changed. The momentum that had carried Hitler's forces hundreds of miles into Soviet territory had begun to slow. The delay at Kiju had cost them weeks. Valuable weeks. And now, what was supposed to be a rapid conquest was being bogged down by mud, by resistance, by the sheer immensity of the Soviet land. Still, the plan to seize Moscow, the heart of the Soviet regime, remained in place. It was called Operation Typhoon. Army Group Center, reinforced after the Southern Campaign, began its drive toward the capital on October 2, 1941. The goal: destroy Soviet forces in front of Moscow and capture the city before winter set in. On paper, it seemed possible. German forces were still fierce, nearly 2 million men, 1,700 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft, and initially, it worked. In 2 rapid movements, German panzer groups executed a pincer attack, encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers near Vienna. The Red Army suffered devastating losses. Entire Soviet armies were swallowed in the forests west of Moscow. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner in just weeks. For Hitler, it was vindication. The enemy is broken, he declared. And once again, German generals believed the capital was within reach. Did not fall, but Moscow, because now the Red Army had changed. What had been a disorganized, crumbling force in June had become a nation of fighters. Factories east of the Urals were producing tanks and rifles by the hour. Reserves from Siberia, battle-hardened, and winter Trendor arriving at the front. And most importantly, Stalin had made a decision. He would not abandon Moscow. While diplomats urged him to evacuate, while his generals wavered, Stalin remained in the city. His presence steadied the defense. He released a storm of propaganda that turned Moscow into a fortress, and his orders were simple. Hold the line. Teenagers built barricades. Soldiers stood ready in frost-covered foxholes. He declared martial law. He called for scorched earth. Civilians dug trenches. The city would not be handed over. It would be defended block by block, if necessary. Meanwhile, the weather turned. The Russian autumn, the dreaded Rasputitsa, or season of mud, arrived with vengeance. The paved roads ended. The forests became swamps. German trucks sank in the mire. Horses collapsed. Tanks lost traction. The Blitzkrieg built for speed was now crawling. Supplies fell behind. Troops marched for days without food or fuel, and still, they pushed forward. By November, German forces were within 25 miles of Moscow. They could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But each mile came at a deadly cost. The Soviet defense was no longer panicked. It was organized, fierce, ruthless. New Soviet tanks, like the T-34, began appearing on the battlefield faster, better armored, and deadlier than anything the Germans had faced. Snipers hid in buildings. Artillery pounded German lines. Every tree, every village, every inch of frozen earth was contested. And then on November 27th, temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. The German army had no winter uniforms. Their engines froze. Lubricants solidified. Guns jammed. The same Wehrmacht that had stormed Paris was now burning fence posts for firewood in the forests outside Moscow. They had no shelter, no boots fit for snow, no plan for a winter war, and Stalin was about to strike back. Thanks to Soviet spies, especially in Tokyo, Stalin had learned that Japan had no intention of attacking the USSR from the east. That meant he could move his elite Siberian divisions west ends of thousands of fresh, winter-hardened troops. They arrived silently, and then, on December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched its first massive. German troops, exhausted and freezing, were caught off guard. T-34 tanks rumbled across snow-covered fields. Infantry divisions flanked German lines. Cavalry units, cavalry charged into action. For the first time since the war began, the German advance broke. Entire divisions were pushed back. Dozens of towns were retaken. And suddenly, the myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. Hitler was furious. He refused to allow retreats. Commanders were ordered to hold every position no matter the cost. Many disobeyed to save their men. Others were dismissed or shot. And back in Berlin, Hitler took a dangerous step. He dismissed his top generals and took direct command of the Eastern Front. It was an act of arrogance and fear. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to end in a few weeks. But by the end of 1941, Germany had failed to take Moscow. The Soviet Union still stood, and for the first time, the German army was in retreat. Had made his greatest mistake as snow piled high and graves filled the forests. A chilling truth set in. This would not be a quick war. It would be a war of annihilation, fought in fire, frost, and blood. He had awakened a giant while the Wehrmacht's advance stalled outside Moscow. To the north, another nightmare had already begun. Leningrad, the former imperial capital, the cradle of the 1917 revolution, and home to over 3 million civilians, was now surrounded by Hitler's army group north. But Hitler didn't want to capture Leningrad. He wanted to erase it. His orders were chillingly clear. Leningrad must vanish from the face of the earth. No surrender was to be accepted. No mercy was to be shown. He believed that by starving the city into submission, he could destroy not only a Soviet stronghold, but a symbol, the beating cultural heart of Bolshevism. And so began one of the longest and most horrific sieges in history, the Siege of Leningrad. It started in September 1941, and it would last 900 days. The city was isolated by land, cut off from food, fuel, and reinforcements. Railways were bombed. Supply lines severed. By winter, temperatures dropped below -30°C. The Neva River froze over, and within the city, hunger became a weapon. Rations were reduced to 125 grams of bread per day. A slice so small it could fit in the palm of a child's hand. But even that bread was mixed with sawdust, wallpaper paste, and anything that could stretch the flour. People boiled shoe leather. They ate glue, rats, even pets. And then they began eating each other. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, became a dark whisper on the frozen streets of Leningrad. And still, they did not surrender. In bombed-out apartments, pianists performed by candlelight. In hospitals with no electricity, surgeons operated with frozen fingers. Children wrote poetry about death and dreamed of spring. The German artillery rained down daily. The Luftwaffe dropped bombs in waves, igniting fires that consumed entire blocks. But the Red Army and the citizens of Leningrad refused to die. Outside the city, Soviet forces launched brutal counterattacks to try to break the but the Germans held their lines, reinforced by Finnish forces to the north. They believed the city would crumble eventually. That starvation would do what bullets had not. But Stalin had no intention of letting Leningrad fall. Even in the chaos of defending Moscow, he diverted supplies. They came not by train, not by truck, but across the ice. The frozen Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, became the city's only lifeline. Convoys of trucks crept across its slippery surface, under constant threat of German air attacks. Drivers called it suicide. But without that road, Leningrad would die. So they drove, by night, in silence, on cracking ice. They delivered flour, ammunition, and medicine, and returned carrying out the dead and the near. Even as thousands perished each day, Leningrad refused to break. And back in Hitler's headquarters, rage festered. Why hadn't the city fallen? Why were the Soviets still resistant? Frustrated, Hitler turned his focus south. Ukraine had been conquered. Kyiv had fallen. Now, he wanted oil, the fuel of empire. He set his eyes on the Caucasus, Baku, Grozny, and the oil fields that could feed the Nazi war machine for years. But with Moscow unconquered and Leningrad defiant, Germany had now split its efforts. The Wehrmacht, though massive, was stretched thin across thousands of miles, and the Red Army was learning. Their generals were gaining experience. New tanks were rolling off assembly lines, and Soviet morale, once broken, was hardening into fury. The siege of Leningrad was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a symbol of survival, a symbol of Soviet resistance, a battle not just of armies, but of wills. Hitler had believed he could annihilate the USSR in weeks. He had believed starvation would break its people. But now, the war was entering a new phase, one not measured. In Leningrad, over 1 million civilians would die before the siege was lifted, 1 out of every 3 people in the city. But they would not give up their home. And Hitler had failed once again. His greatest mistake was not underestimating the Red Army. It was underestimating the Russian spirit, a spirit forged in revolution, hardened by terror, and now reborn in resistance. As 1942 approached, the Nazi high command believed they still had time. They still controlled vast territories. They still believed they could win. But the tide was already turning. The Soviet Union had survived. Leningrad had held. Moscow had not fallen. And now, deep in the snowy steppe, a name would soon rise from the ashes. A city on the Volga. A battle that would change everything. As 1941 gave way to 1942, the war machine had stalled. Operation Barbarossa, once hailed as a masterstroke of blitzkrieg strategy, had turned into a brutal, grinding nightmare. The Wehrmacht still held enormous swathes of Soviet territory, but the cost had been staggering. Over 750,000 German casualties, millions of Soviet dead, and the cities that Hitler had promised would fall. Moscow. The German high command now faced a chilling realization. They had awakened a monster, and it would not die easily. But Hitler wasn't done. He refused to accept defeat. He believed that one more crushing blow, one final campaign, would break the Red Army once and for all. So, in the spring of 1942, Hitler shifted his focus. Not north, not center, but south. The new objective, the Caucasus oil fields. Control the oil, and Germany could fuel its armies for years. Deny it to Stalin, and the Soviet Union might collapse. The operation was codenamed Fall Blau, Case Blue. It would become the blood-soaked path to one of history's most infamous battles. But even before the name Stalingrad echoed across the world, the signs of disaster were already in motion. He split army groups south into 2 separate forces. One to advance into the Caucasus, and the other 2 strike east toward the Volga. His generals objected. They warned that splitting forces across such vast distances, with no reserves, was a recipe for disaster. But Hitler was no longer listening. His obsession with oil, with symbolic targets, with outpacing Stalin at every turn, had blinded him. The Soviets, meanwhile, had begun to recover. Factories relocated east of the Urals were now producing asterisk tanks, rifles, planes, and ammunition faster than ever before. Asterisk. Women worked 16-hour shifts. Children carried coal. The entire Soviet economy had transformed into a war machine. And most importantly, the Red Army had learned how the Wehrmacht moved, how it supplied itself, how it overextended. And in the minds of Soviet commanders, one truth had taken hold. Germany could be beaten. In the summer of 1942, German forces once again surged forward. Cities like Kharkov and Rostov fell under relentless assault. The Volga River, the great lifeline of the Soviet interior, was now within reach, and there, on its western bank, sat a city with Stalin's name on it, a city that had no strategic value except its name. Stalingrad. Hitler wanted to crush it. Stalin vowed to defend it. To egos, to ideologies, to armies, destined to collide in a storm of blood and fire. But that battle, the greatest of the entire war, had not yet begun. Before the ruins of Stalingrad would echo with screams and smoke, the Germans were already showing signs of exhaustion. The long march east had taken its toll. Lines were overstretched. Fuel shortages became constant. Tank divisions were reduced to foot soldiers. And in the skies, the Luftwaffe, once dominant, now struggled to maintain superiority. Meanwhile, the Red Army was gathering strength. New generals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky were reshaping strategy. Massive offensives were being planned in secret, and Soviet resistance in the south was stiffening. By late summer, the Germans reached the Volga, but they had lost momentum. Each step forward was harder than the last. Supply lines were harassed by partisans. Railroads were bombed, and the further they advanced, the thinner their strength became. Then, the first shells began to fall on the river to their backs left no path for retreat. The city was not ready. Civilians remained. The buildings were old. But Stalin made it clear. Asterisk, asterisk, not one step back. Asterisk, asterisk. Order 227. It became law. Units that retreated without permission would be shot. Commanders who hesitated would be removed. Even civilians were conscripted into defense battalions. The people of Stalingrad became soldiers. Women dug trenches and laid barbed wire. Factories stayed open under bombardment, churning out weapons as shells crashed nearby. By September 1942, German troops entered the city limits. And there, everything changed. The fast-paced blitzkrieg was useless in the ruins. Stalingrad became a battlefield unlike any other. Fought building by building, room by room. Streets changed hands multiple times a day. German troops called it rat war. Brutal, chaotic, relentless. Grenades replaced rifles. Knives replaced tactics. Snipers hunted in silence from broken rooftops. And through it all, Soviet soldiers kept arriving, ferried across the Volga under constant fire. Stalin would not let the city fall, but Hitler wouldn't let it go. He poured more men into the meat grinder. Every victory was a trap. Every advance exposed German flanks, but the weakened German flanks north and south of it. By November, the noose had been set. Soviet generals launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that didn't strike the city. Within days, the Sixth Army, 300,000 German soldiers, was encircled, trapped, frozen, cut off from supplies. What had begun in the summer as a march for oil was now a death sentence. In Berlin, Hitler refused to allow a retreat. He promised airlifts, reinforcements, salvation. None came in time. Inside the city, starvation and frost claimed the elite of the Wehrmacht. They held on. Officers ate horse meat. Soldiers burned books to stay warm. And yet, for weeks, the world watched, until finally, in February 1943, the German commander, Friedrich Paulus, surrendered. Operation Barbarossa was dead, and with it, the myth of Nazi invincibility. Germany had lost its best army. It had failed to break the Soviet Union. It had turned a war of conquest into a war of survival. And from this moment forward, the tide of World War II would never turn back again.